Hello again, and welcome to the second half of the recorded material for the American imperialism, American expansion material. When we finished up on the previous recording, we were talking about the Spanish-American War. It's the event that really once and for all brings the United States into the colonial arena. And even though the U.S. doesn't acquire vast amounts of territory, it certainly doesn't have an empire of the scale of Britain's or France's or something like that. It is a significant change in the way that Americans conceive of their nation's role and relationship with the rest of the world. And so it is a pretty big transition in a lot of ways, bringing the United States more into the mix in terms of international affairs. And one of the figures who is at the center of the Spanish-American War, and also will then become the guiding light in driving America's push towards being a much more active and involved and interventionist nation abroad, is Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, at the beginning of the Spanish-American War, is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which doesn't sound like it would have a lot of power or influence, but in fact Roosevelt makes that position something fairly significant. And even though he resigns his post in order to serve in the war, he still is a pretty prominent political figure. He's going to be McKinley's vice presidential running mate in the 1900 election. When McKinley is assassinated in Baltimore in September of 1901, Roosevelt, much to the horror of prominent Republicans around the country, Roosevelt becomes president. Roosevelt has a very expansive idea about America's role in the world. And especially because of the consequences of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt recognizes that now is the moment to really push the country into a broader and more significant role internationally. He sees this as being an obligation, a responsibility, a privilege for the United States, and begins then implementing policies and expanding parts of the U.S. military, involving the United States in the political affairs of countries in the Caribbean or in Central America, in an effort to assure that the United States assumes that position, assumes that role in the world. And when it comes to policy statements, one of the things that he does is add a sort of an extension or an addendum to an earlier policy statement known as the Monroe Doctrine. So way back in 1823, the president at the time, James Monroe, decides that he wants to tell European powers, hands off. In the 1820s, Spain was in the process of losing its empire, and Britain and France were in the process of trying to expand theirs. And Monroe decides that it's the responsibility of the United States to prevent European powers from sticking their noses in the actions of the Western Hemisphere. So this is North and Central and South America. And so he says the U.S. will intervene, it will step in, if there are any attempts by European nations to colonize parts of the Western Hemisphere. In 1823, the United States didn't have any military capacity to stop countries like Britain or France from getting involved in Central or South America. It was beyond the realm of possibility. So this isn't something that Monroe and the United States would have been able to enforce, but it was definitely something that the United States is expressing its desire to maintain the Western Hemisphere as a sphere of influence just for the U.S. But it's a very defensive kind of policy, right? It says, we will remain neutral until such a moment as we feel that Europe is unreasonably involving itself in this situation. Roosevelt, on the other hand, about 80 years later, issues the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So this is kind of an expansion, it is an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine that says, if the United States believes that the actions of any country in the Western Hemisphere are threatening the stability of the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. will intervene in that nation. So this doesn't necessarily mean the involvement of Europe in the Americas. This means if internally something is happening in a country and that action or that event seems to destabilize the Western Hemisphere or destabilize or threaten American interests in a particular country, Roosevelt says the United States has the permission and the responsibility to use its growing power to step in and police the situation. So recently, the United States has been involved in a variety of different efforts that pundits or talking heads or people will call, quote unquote, police power. This is really what Roosevelt is advocating. He says that the United States has the ability and the authority and the right to get involved in these situations, especially if American interests are at stake or threatened, but even if not, if the United States feels that it can push a particular situation towards a better outcome or a better resolution, the U.S. will get involved. These are overt statements about American policy. Roosevelt also has kind of a personal idea about the way American foreign policy should work, and it gets nicknamed big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt's phrase was, when you're involved in relationships or interactions with other nations, it always helps to speak softly and carry a big stick, right? So you can say what you want, you can be sort of cautious about the way you approach things, but as long as the other people at the negotiating table know that you are willing and able to use force or coercion if necessary, then that will help to influence the outcome of that diplomacy. So it's not necessarily using actual military might. You're not invading a country or attacking a country necessarily. But you are reminding, gently nudging the realization that, hey, I may not be actually active in trying to throw my weight around, but I do have weight that I can throw around if necessary. And this can certainly be military. It's sort of the most obvious version. But it can also be diplomatic, political, it can be economic. So an example today would be something like sanctions that the United States has placed on countries like Iran or North Korea, right? We don't want these countries to do a particular thing, but rather than invading them and using the Marines or the Air Force or the Army to force them in one direction or another, we'll say, okay, until you do X and Y, we will not send you these things. So this is a type of big stick diplomacy, right? The idea that you're using some kind of force or pressure or influence to compel a country to behave in one way or another. So an example of that, during Roosevelt's tenure, right at the end of Roosevelt's tenure, is what's known as the Great White Fleet. And the Great White Fleet was Roosevelt sort of demonstrating America's newfound naval power to the rest of the world. So during Roosevelt's administration, he mandates a kind of crash course of building a powerful navy. And so within a decade or so, the United States Navy grows by 16 new battleships. And in the early 1900s, battleships were the thing that defined a navy, right? They were the greatest expression of military power that a country could have. So these ships are sent around the world, a journey of 43,000 miles. They stop at 20 different ports. 14,000 sailors are part of this whole endeavor. And the idea was, one, to sort of announce America's arrival on the world scene and say, look, rest of the world, the United States is now an active player and is now a power in the world, the second strongest navy in the world, in fact, behind just Britain. But it's also, more specifically, to send a message directly to Japan to say, okay, Japan, we know that you, in the last 50 years, have begun expanding your role in the Pacific Ocean and in East Asia. The United States just wants to show that we are not blind to this, and now we certainly have the power to intervene if we feel that it is necessary. And so it has a general kind of a purpose, but it also has a very specific and particular kind of purpose. And so here again, this is not a fleet that is going anywhere to actually bombard any ports. It's not using its heavy guns to attack any of the places that it's visiting. It is there just as a symbolic gesture to say, in case you were curious, the United States now has the ability to use these battleships however it deems necessary. And so that is the kind of big stick diplomacy. Another example is what happens with Panama. With the Spanish-American War, the United States gets an interest in Cuba, and it gets possession of Puerto Rico. And this brings the U.S. into much more specific interest in what's going on in Panama. So, ever since the 1870s and 1880s, there had been an effort led by the French to try to build a canal across Central America. And after much debate and conversation about whether that canal should go through Nicaragua or if it should go through Panama, the decision is it should go through Panama. And so the French begin this massive effort to build a canal through the skinny part of Panama. Well, all of Panama is skinny. Well, it ends up failing. The materials, the equipment are still there. The original cuts and excavations that the French company has attempted are still there. But the French effort collapses. So the United States says, hey, maybe we should get involved. The problem is, Panama is not an independent country at the time. So the United States has purchased all of the rights and all of the equipment and all of the land that the French construction effort had begun. But Colombia, the country that actually controls Panama, refuses to allow the United States to expand the canal effort at all. And so the United States then decides, okay, this is an easy enough solution. We will just send a cruiser, a warship, the USS Nashville, to a port on the northern coast of Panama. And around the same time, we will encourage rebels and militants in Panama to rebel. And I apologize, my cat's in the background crying. We will encourage militants in Panama, independence fighters in Panama, to rebel. They will be supported by the fact that the USS Nashville is cutting off any access that the Colombian Navy could have to try to put down this resistance. The cruiser arrives in Panama on November 2nd. On November 7th, the United States officially recognizes Panamanian independence, and within another 10 days, Panama has signed a contract granting the United States full and free access to the canal zone and a lease that the United States will pay over the next roughly 90 years in order to secure the right to control the Panama Canal Zone. So here again, Roosevelt is not using actual military force. The Nashville is not involved in firing on any enemy individuals or enemy positions. It is simply there to lend support and to blockade the possibility of the Colombian Navy getting to Colon, Panama, and influencing the outcome in a way that the United States doesn't want. So ultimately, Panama is granted its independence with no small measure of support and assistance from the United States. The canal then is in the hands of the American effort. Over time, the U.S. manages to complete the canal, but it is a total of almost 30 years worth of construction. Almost 30,000 people lose their lives in the process, whether it's from accidents on the job site, but especially from disease like yellow fever and malaria. The canal runs sort of northwest to southeast, which seems a little strange because it's connecting oceans that are opposite each other east to west, but because of the geography of the way Panama is laid out, the canal actually runs more north-south than it does east-west. The canal, though, ends up eliminating weeks and weeks from a transit from one side of the country to the other by boat. So in other words, if you were traveling from New York to San Francisco, if you were traveling from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean more generally, you would have to go all the way south around the very tip bottom of South America and then back up into the Pacific Ocean. Or if you were going the opposite direction, you'd have to go around South America and then back up into the Atlantic. So this is cutting 7,000 miles off of that journey. So it's a hugely significant kind of an achievement. And it is another example of the United States getting directly involved in the affairs of another country in order to advance its own interests. This is not something that the United States would have even conceived of around the years of the Civil War or before that. And so it is a significant kind of difference in the understanding of America's role in the world. So that's the end of this section. Our next section is actually going to look at a period in American history that's known as the Progressive Era, which is a period of a lot of significant change in politics and society. It's a reform movement that in some ways has very significant ripple effects all the way down to the present. And so, really interesting topic. I hope everybody is doing really, really well. Let me know if you've got questions about any of the content or any of the assignments in the class, and I will certainly do my best to answer those. Be sure that you are reviewing the full PowerPoints on Blackboard for all of these different lectures so that you have all of that content and all of that material ready should it appear in exams or anything like that. So that's the end of this section, and I will see everybody again soon.